So we're staying with the question or the topic of EU FTAs, but we're looking at South America and Southeast Asia in comparison, how the EU treats those organizations. Here you see a world map that is organized into regional organizations, as you can obviously see. So we have a trend since the 1990s that regional organizations popped up all over the globe. So we not only have the European Union, but in South America, for example, the Mercado Común del Sur, the Mercosur, consisting of Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and recently Venezuela. And in Southeast Asia, for example, we have the Association of the Southeast Asian Nations, consisting of, for example, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam. And the EU has taken this development of the establishment of regional organizations into account, and it has set up a dense network of inter-regional relations. So, for example, with Mercosur, it has had inter-regional relations since 1995, with ASEAN since the 1970s, and also with other regional organizations. It has set up inter-regional networks or has actually negotiated FTAs with the overall regions. The EU has committed itself to support regional integration and to a multilateral world order, and in the cases of Mercosur and ASEAN, interregionalism was even a guiding principle in its relations with these organizations. Further, with both organizations, the EU has had interregional negotiations in the case of Mercosur on an association agreement, and in the case of Southeast Asia, an FTA. However, in 2007, the EU launched a strategic partnership with Brazil, and in 2010, the EU shifted to bilateral free trade agreement negotiations with Singapore, and afterwards also with other ASEAN countries, for example, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. So the obvious question is, why has the EU such an incoherent foreign trade policy? Or more precisely, why has the EU switched venues from interregional negotiations to bilateral attempts in the cases of Brazil and Singapore? And in order to answer this question, I turn to a theoretical model, which I will briefly present to you, also the conceptual clarifications and the assumptions of this theoretical model, and afterwards I will briefly walk you through the results. However, probably not in detail because of the lack of time. So I have one important assumption, that is that the EU is a unitary actor on the international stage, represented by the European Commission, who conducts negotiations and who is responsible for external trade affairs. Further, I focus on the European side of these relationships with Mercosur and ASEAN, and I focus on the mandate of the EU, on the design of the EU's foreign trade policy, and I do not actually look at the bargaining process between the EU and the partner regions. So conceptually, how I understand foreign trade policy, it is part of foreign economic policy that aims at establishing a favorable external environment. In this sense, foreign trade policy can be further distinguished into actual objectives and instruments, and I do not look at the objectives of foreign trade policy, but I will focus on the instruments, which can be distinguished into venues in which the EU actually negotiates, for example, interregional versus bilateral. And it can be further distinguished into what we've just heard. What issues are included in the negotiations? Is it a comprehensive package, as Guillaume just outlined, or does it target selective issues, for example, just investments? And keep in mind that I have a holistic understanding of trade, meaning not just trade barriers, but also non-tariff trade barriers, investment, services, political aspects related to trade. So this is the outcome of the dependent variable, the design of the foreign trade policy on which the EU varies. We can have a design that is comprehensive and interregional. But we can also have a design that is selective and bilateral, so large and narrow scope in opposition. And then we also have, of course, comprehensive bilateralism and selective interregionalism. And this is the variation I'm going to explain with my theoretical model. I turn to international relations theories in order to answer this question, why the EU has varied between these four outcomes. And I apply a model that is rooted in realism. Now, I don't know who of you is familiar with realism, but I do not mean Meissner's offensive realism or Walt's neo-realist approach, but rather I turn to a more classical realist approach. Why is it realist? It's realist because it focuses on power and because it focuses on extra-regional factors in order to explain this variation. When I speak about power, I do mean economic power. I do not mean military power. So when we look at economic power, we can have commerce or economic relations as an instrument. On the other hand, we can also have competition between certain actors for economic relations as such. And I focus on this latter aspect. To what extent does the EU compete with other actors for economic relations? For example, with the US or China. So according to this theoretical model, the EU seeks to secure its power on the international stage. And part of that is economic security competition with the US or China, for example. Thus, the EU strives to establish, maintain, or improve trade relations with other actors. And one instrument that is intuitively appropriate is FTAs or other negotiated agreements, because they can be exclusive in the sense that they target a specific partner, and they can be comprehensive in the sense that they include all pertinent trade issues at the same time. So as we just heard, these agreements, they encompass two dimensions, that is issues and addressees. And what we can see on issues, what we just heard, the EU moved beyond the traditional features in trade agreements, but increasingly included also regulatory issues. So if there is a divergence, however, of regulatory standards between the EU and the US, for example, there will not only be a divergence of regulatory standards, as Meissner argued in his famous book, but it will actually be a competition for setting these regulatory standards in other parts of the world. So what we can derive as a hypothesis in a way is that the broader the trade relations between rival actors, for example the US and the partner region, for example Mercosur, the more likely is the EU to use a comprehensive design of its foreign trade policy. Further, if there is a competition between great powers, between the EU, China, US, for economic relations with the partner regions, the partner region can actually use this to their advantage. They can team up and simultaneously negotiate and thereby improve their bargaining power within the negotiations. However, according to a realist model, the EU prefers bilateral negotiations because in bilateral negotiations, the EU has the biggest bargaining leverage. So if there is a competition between great powers, the US and the EU, for example, for economic relations with Mercosur, for example, the EU will adjust its strategy to the partner region. And if the EU perceives the partner region to be cohesive, to have a lot of team spirit, the EU will apply an inter-regional approach. Whereas in return, if the partner region turns out to be non-cohesive, the EU will turn to a bilateral approach. So as you can see, these two extra-regional factors, according to this model, can explain the variation of the outcome. So if rival actors have broad relations and the partner region is cohesive, then the EU will apply a comprehensive inter-regional design. Whereas if rival actors have narrow relations and the partner region is non-cohesive, the EU will apply a selective bilateral design. So I tested this theoretical model, these explanatory factors, across the EU-Mercosur negotiations, EU-ASEAN negotiations, EU-Brazil Strategic Partnership, and EU-Singapore FTA, based on a lot of documents and elite interviews, but I don't have to go into the details of that now. some descriptive results. Obviously, the EU-Mercosur and EU-ASEAN negotiations had an interregional design, and in addition, they were comprehensive. Okay.
Sorry, there's a minute of grace.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So the EU-Singapore FTA is obviously bilateral, and it was comprehensive although as well. Further, the EU-Brazil strategic partnership was bilateral obviously, and it was selective because the EU only negotiated non-tariff trade barriers and investment issues with Brazil, or applied these issues in the strategic partnership. So I cannot go through all the details of the results. I just put here this table, and you can see that actually the outcomes of the variables match. So in the EU-ASEAN, we had broad relations of rival actors and a perceived high cohesion. In the EU-Singapore FTA, we had broad relations of rival actors and a low cohesion within ASEAN. In the Mercosur case, it was broad relations and high cohesion, and in the Brazil case, it was actually narrow relations by the US and China and low cohesion, and that led to the outcomes. So summing up the results. In the ASEAN case, the EU shifted from interregional to bilateral negotiations because the EU had an ambitious vision for an FTA, because the US and China beforehand had negotiated ambitious, comprehensive FTAs. However, that ambitious vision clashed with the heterogeneity within ASEAN, which the EU came to realize during the negotiations, while the negotiations were ongoing. In the Mercosur case, the shift from the interregional negotiations to the bilateral strategic partnership was a result of the Brazil's strategic importance to the EU because of its geographical approximation to the US and its increasing trade ties with the US and China, and the decreasing unity within Mercosur, which made it impossible to agree on the association agreement. So the results overall, they corroborate the two hypotheses derived from the theoretical model. It turned out that extra-regional factors are actually crucial variables for explaining the EU's foreign trade policy making. And I did observe economic and regulatory competition between the EU and other actors, the US and China precisely. And interregionalism was not so much part of a value promotion of the EU's foreign trade policy, but rather it was a tool rationally applied. So that this also puts a bit into question the debate on how interregionalism complies with the EU's normative power. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We move right on to Daniel.